In this video, I'll explain the rationale for JDBC and how to use JDBC. First, a database usually runs separately from your application. It may be a separate program on the same server, or in large systems, a database could be running on entirely separate servers. So we need a way to connect our Java code to the database. Fortunately, databases are fairly standardized. If they support SQL, then they operate in more or less the same way. You send SQL and you get back results. And this is what JDBC is for. JDBC standardizes the way that you connect to and query SQL databases. Actually, JDBC is a great example of how standards work in Java. Standards are used in Java to introduce new technologies to the platform. A standards process defines an API, and this API defines the interfaces and classes that need to be implemented. Companies and open source groups can then release their own packages that implement the interfaces and the classes of the API. So in the case of JDBC, as a programmer, you only need to know a few key interfaces, and then you can write a program that's theoretically able to query any SQL database on the market that supports JDBC. Here are the three main concepts you need to understand for JDBC: connections, statements, and results. A connection is a link between a Java program and a database. Underneath the hood, this is often a real network connection, and the connection is used to send SQL commands to the database and return the results. A statement is a single SQL query or command. A statement runs on a connection, and when the statement is executed, it returns a result set. And a result set is the tabular data that comes back as a result of executing a statement. So we could say that connections are used to create statements, and statements are executed to create result sets. So here's how we execute queries in JDBC. We get a connection from the driver manager by passing a connection string. This is the database equivalent of a URL or an email address. This connection string tells us to use JDBC to connect to a Derby database that's located on port 1527 on the local computer, to connect to a database named AIP with the username AIP and password AIP. This connection can then be used to create a statement, and that statement can be used to execute an SQL query. Finally, the query produces a result set. You can move from row to row of the result set by calling next. Next returns true if there is a next row, so this means that if you call next in a while loop, it will loop over all the rows of the result set. And for each row, you can call getters to get the columns from the result. Here, I'm first retrieving a column by number. This gets the first column from the result. This is one surprising thing about JDBC. It always counts from the number 1. In computing, number 0 usually refers to the first of something. In JDBC, it starts with 1, so the first column is column number 1. In the other line, I'm retrieving a column by name. This gets the column named full name. Now, JDBC connections can use up a lot of resources, not just memory, but also long-lived network connections, connection limits, as well as cursors, locks, and other resources on the server. So you need to be very sure to close any connections when you're finished with them. If you don't close connections, you'll eventually run into limits as your application leaks resources. And this can be a big problem in practice. Many systems work perfectly in testing, but fail in production because of resource leaks that only get revealed when the system is under stress. To free these resources, to prevent memory leaks, JDBC objects have a close method, and you should call close as soon as you finish with them. Now, in theory, you only need to close a connection object, and then everything else also closes. But in practice, it's a good idea to close everything. The driver may be buggy, or your code may be buggy, and closing makes it clear in your code when you finish with the resource. If you execute multiple queries on a single connection, then closing a result set before executing the next will also help free up resources such as database cursors, locks, and temporary data. Since Java 7, we've been able to do much the same thing with much less lines of code. This code here does the same thing as closing each resource manually. You'll notice that the try statement begins with an opening block in parentheses. This is called a resource specification. Any objects declared here must be closable, and when the try block ends, Java makes sure that anything in the resource specification is closed for you. So even if your code throws an exception, calls return, or otherwise does something wrong, your connections and other JDBC objects should be automatically closed for you when the method returns. So this is really the way to go. So the key things to remember with JDBC are that connections create statements and statements create result sets. Counting in JDBC starts with 1 instead of 0, and you need to remember to close everything. Now to finish, I said that connections can use up a lot of resources. Closing connections helps conserve these resources. But can you think of other ways that you could conserve resources?